Recently, the House and the Senate passed a bill that deals with the topic of housing affordability. It's something that many people know is a serious problem here in the United States right now. Unfortunately, even with that bill being passed, it was held up by the White House, part of wanting to pass the Save America Act. Still, the bill looks to try and address, as I said, some needed issues. And we're going to talk about those issues in the housing sector with Ben Keys, who's Wharton's real estate professor. Ben, great to talk to you. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Dan.
So, obviously, you and I have talked about housing affordability. And I guess from that perspective, does this bill, taking the politics out of play for a moment, does the bill start to address some of the issues that you and I have talked about over the years?
Yeah, well, I wish we could take the politics out of this. This is an exciting bipartisan bill that I think is a clear recognition of the housing affordability challenge in America. There's a true recognition from this bill that this is a priority for American households, that the cost of housing, either for homeowners or for renters, has gotten way too high, and you can benchmark that to house prices as a proportion relative to annual household incomes, which has essentially doubled since the 1950s. You can look at this in terms of rental burdens, where 25% of all renters in the US, that's more than 10 million households, pay more than 50% of their income each month towards their rent. So I think this bill represents a true recognition of that problem. And I think it lays the groundwork for some transformational efforts to improve housing affordability. But it's just one very small step in a much longer path.
All right. So, on the cost perspective, how does this bill look to address the pricing component?
So I think there's a few elements of this bill that could address the high cost of housing. Now, all of these elements of the bill sort of have to work in concert. I view this bill a bit like a buffet. It's sort of, there are a lot of different directions that you could go, and there's very little funding attached to the bill, which we're going to talk more about in just a second. But when you combine some of the individual elements, you can put together what looks like a pretty nice plate when it comes to addressing some of the issues of housing construction. So there's elements here that are going to convey best practices when it comes to zoning and building codes.
Right.
There are elements that are going to streamline some of the review processes. There's additional financing tools. There's a number of pilot programs and an innovation fund. And if you put all of those elements together, you can start to see a path where there's going to be more federal support and more federal financing for some local efforts to get more buildings built.
So what does this how does this change the dynamic for builders? And I ask that because you and I've I think I've asked you this several times. It feels like we are and have been for a long time in a spot where we're still building houses, but maybe we're not building the right type of houses. And maybe we need to start to think about the starter home once again and whether or not that's something that can be kind of brought back into the mix here.
Yeah, I think the bill does a number of things, especially on the manufactured housing side. So when we think of manufactured housing, that's going to be an especially smaller type of housing that tends to be for the lowest income homeowners. There, we're going to see some additional regulatory relief when it comes to the design of manufactured housing and the ways in which they're built. There's a pilot to expand small dollar loans. And so one of the challenges has been getting financing for these types of projects. Then there's a broader set of tools that are being put forward to shorten local permitting processing times and adopt pre-approved designs for certain permit approval. So all of those elements could lead towards improvements in the creation of starter homes.
And I saw that one of the components also in there is, and you talked about the speeding up of the process, is also the speeding up of the process of environmental review as well to see, make sure you can build on certain lands, I guess, correct?
That's right. So I think environmental review is a very important concept, and it should be applied appropriately. But I think there's a number of projects that do get tied up in environmental review processes and the sort of NIMBY, not in my backyard
Yeah.
movement that finds these different hooks to latch onto and slow down development processes where they're not in favor of it. Often the environmental review is one of those hooks that they're able to latch onto. And so I think there's a number of common sense reforms in this bill that don't actually go that far, but I think go in the right direction towards saying, hey, let's be sensible and reasonable when it comes to the amount of environmental review necessary for, say, infill multifamily housing development, by which I mean it's sort of already on a street grid.
Yeah.
There's already buildings surrounding it. So, what are the environmental impacts of building one more apartment building in a neighborhood that already has many of them? I think some of those modifications could streamline things quite a bit.
One of the topics that's been talked about a lot is also that of the institutional investor, and seemingly people or companies from that group buying up just a ton of properties and that making it a greater challenge. Is that going to be addressed in this?
So it is addressed in this, but it's in an interesting way, and it may have perverse consequences. We'll see how this plays out. So one of the things that they put in the bill was a limitation that corporate buyers can't acquire a portfolio of more than 350 single family homes in the US. And taken in a vacuum, that sounds like, well, great, there's this opportunity for home buyers now that the corporate market is going to step aside. But it doesn't seem to do much with the existing firms that already own many multiples more than 350 units. It seems, at least on its face, to grandfather in those big players like Invitation Homes, which owns over 80,000 houses across the US. American Homes for Rent, AMH, owns about 60,000 homes. The bill doesn't seem to touch them. And if anything, it might give them a competitive moat from new players coming into the space. And so I think some of those elements in the bill, the corporate ownership elements, they got outsized attention because
Right.
there's a very, I think, vocal group of people who are upset about corporate ownership of real estate and especially these big players. But I'm not sure that the bill is designed in a way to really address the tension there, and it may actually provide greater competitive strength to the players who were already in before and are grandfathered in based on this bill.
How long then, once this bill does get through, and I think we assume it will at some point, would it take to really get some of these elements up and running? Because it would feel like in any kind of marketplace, you're still going to need some time to ramp up a lot of these components, correct?
Absolutely. And this bill is called the Road to Housing bill. And this is where the rubber meets the road. It's going
Right.
from the potential elements of this bill, which I think really do have the potential to be influential to today's political realities. And when you look at the different elements of this bill, a lot of the elements of the bill require work being done by either HUD or the FHFA. There's many elements in the bill that say, well, we're directing HUD to do this, that, or the other. But if you look at this administration's proposed budget for FY27, they're proposing cutting $10 billion from HUD, about a 13% decrease in HUD's financing. And so you're going to give HUD all these additional tasks, but not actually give it the funds to do these things. The FHFA is also tasked with doing a number of things, but just this year they've lowered their review, their expectations for affordable housing, especially to low income and minority dominated communities. And so, what you need for a bill like this to be successful is it needs to be funded and it needs to be functional. And I'm skeptical of both of those things, especially with the other cost drivers that this administration is putting more pressure on. And so, when we have tariffs, which are raising the
Yeah.
cost of materials, when we have a immigration policy which is reducing the available labor for the construction industry, and that's a story we're going to be hearing more about in the coming months, and we look at the high financing costs, we've seen those 10-year interest rates rise sharply in the wake of what's happening in the Middle East. And so mortgage rates are stubbornly high at 6.5. And so when you look at the costs of for construction financing as well, all of those elements are pointing against this bill having any short-term impact.
Beyond what is in the bill, what are some of the other areas that you think need to be addressed at some point down the road, I guess?
Yeah, I think there's a few other things in the bill that are exciting and that could grow into something bigger. One is this whole home Repair Act. So when we think about the housing market, we often spend a lot of time thinking about the new units that are coming online, but not about the old units that are falling into disrepair and falling out of the housing market. And one of the efforts actually from Philadelphia's own Nikhil Saval in the state of Pennsylvania was to create this Home Repairs Act that would provide grants or forgivable loans to help especially small, lower income owners repair their homes.
Yeah.
That's now being introduced at the national level. I think that has some true potential if it can be scaled up. So that's an element that I'm excited about. I think there's other ideas related to innovation funds and offering a mix of carrots and sticks to increase supply. On the carrot side, I like this idea of a fund that's going to be a competitive grant program that's going to look for communities that are innovating and try to support those innovations and then hopefully scale them up. So I think there's real promise there. I think on the carrot side, this is a bill that doesn't really change the basic supply and demand when it comes to the housing market and where local control dominates. And so thinking about different ways to incentivize local governments to change their building codes, to change their zoning codes, I think that's a much larger, more
Yeah.
ambitious project that this bill doesn't take on.
Ben, always great to talk with you. Thanks very much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Dan.
You got it. Ben Keys, Wharton real estate professor, joining us here on the show.